So hello everyone, it is Jaden and welcome back to the Spilled Coffee Studio channel. It has definitely been a hot minute since I've last been on here, but school definitely kicked my butt this semester, which, honestly, I can't be surprised since I was taking 4 studio classes plus a seminar, so I honestly can't be surprised. But anyways, I thought I would do a little flip through of my school sketchbook. This has been the last 2 semesters and I really enjoyed using this. It's technically not a sketchbook, it's a Midori notebook in I believe it's the B6 slim size. I already got myself another one of these for next year, which is going to be my final year at JMU. But yeah, let me stop yapping and get into the flip through. All right, so I just brought you all in a little bit closer and you might be able to hear some rain. So I apologize for that. But anyways, here is my sketchbook. It's decorated with a art themed sticker sheet I made, plus a Spilled Coffee Studio sticker. I was originally going to use this sketchbook for sorry about the glare, for kind of like any and everything. And then it ended up just being my school sketchbook. So I kind of used this JMU sticker I made to kind of cover up what was originally written, and then just put my JMU sketchbook. And then I put a little paper clip to kind of just like cover up some of these sketches that were not going to be for school, but I didn't want to tear them out. But now let's get into the school sketches. So this was for last semester, so fall semester. The first 2 paintings, which I like to call a slow day at work, these were, this is literally kind of like a repeat of like a drawing that I already did, but a little bit more spooky. So one of my things that I really like to do is I like to kind of give myself like a little list of like some of the things or like the vibes I'm going for, and then just do really sloppy sketches. And then for this one, I like found some like pictures on like Pinterest that I thought like really fit the vibe that I was going for this particular piece. So I like printed them out and included them in here, just to kind of make like a little bit of a mood board, which is always like really fun. You can also do that with like magazines and stuff, just kind of make like little mood boards or collages for like your pieces, which are always, like I said, so much fun to do. So this piece I was really struggling with, or at least 2 pieces. There was actually 2. I had so many different ideas. I thought of like the hands coming out of the posters, which actually I kind of like really vibing with that like kind of idea now that I think about it. So maybe I'll do that as like an entirely separate piece. That would be like super cool. And then it went into me like creating my own monster, and then I was like making like a person or like a figure like wearing like one of those old plastic Halloween masks. I thought it'd be kind of cool to do like superheroes, because it's kind of like this like it's like Batman, but they're like kind of like spooky and creepy. But I ended up kind of doing this like creepy clown. As you can see, again, like 50,000 different ideas. I could not make up my mind. I have so many little notes about like I don't know what to do. Should the door be open? What other like little items will I have around? And also include like some pop-ups of the pieces as I'm talking about them. But I finally was able to come to a conclusion. This was for another painting for Pumpkinhead. So in fall semester, all of my paintings were kind of like spooky vibes. So the Pumpkinhead is kind of based off of like my family story of like a boogeyman like character that was told to me. So this was kind of the idea I eventually came up with him kind of like crawling through the window. I ended up crocheting like part of the blanket and attached it to the canvas, and I also used foam clay to make like these vines that are kind of like coming out and off. And then this was for my, everything's also all over the place. It's not like in particular order, but this was for my fiber arts class, and we were doing a thing or a project called layered biographies, and we were able to do like our own biography, historical biography, like anything like that. So I did like my biography was like the artist and activist during the AIDS epidemic, or like the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. So I made a list of like some of the things that were happening, and then like materials to like include, because not only were we supposed to use fabric, but we were also supposed to use materials that would have related in some way to our topic. So, and then I included a couple of like pieces that were kind of my inspiration. So one was The Portrait of Ross in LA by Felix Gonzalez Torres, The Unfinished Painting by Keith Haring, and then the AIDS Memorial Quilt. And then, so I had, again, this was like a bunch of different ideas and not really knowing like where to go for this piece. So I had like maybe having the piece of like fabric that my professor gave us to use. Thought about like cutting it up and like attaching it in different ways. I kind of like went with that. I was having different materials. I thought about doing like the same project, but like totally scrapping like the AIDS like crisis or like idea, but I did eventually do that. And this is kind of similar to like what my final piece ended up being. It was like the background was like resembles a quilt. Again, I'll include pictures. And then I did like different signs of like a protest on the front, as well as including one of those little like blowhorn, air horn things, or whatever they're called. And then these are some of the different like posters that I recreated in some way, either through like stitching them on. I used like paint and ink for like this poster. Like I literally like painted my hand, so it's my handprint on my piece. I used like actual condoms on the piece. I used candy wrappers. I used a bunch of different things, and it's a piece that I'm really proud of and I absolutely adore. I'm just really happy with it. This is the second painting part of the kind of like spooky like family versions of like the boogeyman. So this is the Jackma Wisp, is like what my grandmother was told like growing up on Tangier Island, which is a part of Virginia. And it was basically like if you don't behave or like you don't come home, like once it starts getting dark, Jackma Wisp will get you. And I used these two photos that I took the last time I was on Tangier as like a reference. So like that sign appears like in my painting, and then like the houses in the background of this one. And for this piece, in terms of like mixed media, I mixed in sand into the paint on like that I used for the ground to give it like a little bit of grit and a little bit of just something extra, some extra texture to the painting. Next up is a bunch of notes that I made for my final for my fibers class. I struggled so much with this project. So we had to combine two different systems or maps or something along those lines, two that wouldn't go together, and make them like combine them in this piece. The one that I was really like originally going to do was the New York City subway station or system, and like a medical system or like hospitals or something like that. And I tried so many different things, but it was not working for me. I then thought about doing like still keeping with like the subway system kind of theme, but doing like the solar system. I didn't like that either. And then I took a break from that, and this was the ideas for my final piece last semester, or like fall semester, which is the Baobinshi or C. I remember when I looked it up, it had like two different kinds of pronunciations, so I'm not 100% like which is the correct one, but it's from Scottish folklore, and it's basically a woman who wears like green, and she has like the legs of like a deer, and she will appear like when hunters will make the wish for like a woman to be there with them, typically a woman who isn't like their wife. So I came up with different ideas before. Also, the sketches for this one is like really bad. This is like kind of similar to how like my final piece ended up looking. More mixed media in that piece. I ended up doing I used like both foam clay and just regular polymer clay to make busts of heads, like how people will mount deer heads, but I instead did that with like human heads. This is kind of like a femme fatale kind of like piece, but I would like, there's stuff I would love to change about it, but in the end I was very happy with how it came out. And then this is for my figure drawing class. Our final was a self-portrait. So I was coming up with different ideas that I thought would be like really fun. I was trying to make it really fun. So I thought doing like a Sims moodlet kind of thing. I thought about doing posters, doing like a movie poster was definitely some of my ideas. More again, like the posters, like taking like, instead of God Saves the Queen from like the Sex Pistols, doing like God Save the College Student because it was like final season. But I ended up doing the Sims one. So it was very inspired, and I was doing like inspired by art, caffeinated and tired were like my little moodlets. I would have taken more time on the piece. I did it in watercolor, but again, with final season, I had like 50,000 different things going on. It wasn't as good as I would have liked, but it was still like a fun little piece, especially because in figure drawing, we worked a lot with like charcoal and stuff, which I don't like doing, but I did enjoy like with our finals and stuff, we got the ability to use different materials, so I was kind of like happy with it. And then this is like the final sketch for my fall semester. As you can see, spring semester got like so much more writing and love compared to fall semester in my sketchbook. Yeah, I had a lot going on in my fall semester, or I mean spring semester. But this was kind of like the final for my systems project. I ended up doing like the way that our brain works, and then like the subway system, and I used like different naturally dye fabric and like cut it out to be like the little parts of like the subway system, but also like the little like parts of like your brain. And then I also included buttons, or I stitched buttons on it to be like the little stops in like the subway station. But yeah, next we can get on to my spring semester. So I took ceramics this semester, and it was hand building, so we didn't do anything with the wheel. And our first project was using pinch pots, and I was coming up with ideas of what to make with that. I thought about doing, I was originally going to do a record player, but I was struggling a lot with it. But as you can see, at first I really was convinced I was going to do it, but like I said, it was definitely a struggle. For screen print, this is my first edition. I had several different ideas. This is the one I did end up doing, with the little quote, "I don't cook, but I like to stir the pot." And then this was like a note about like which, or like how I should, like in which order I should apply the different inks. And then this is just like the little like grade slip that our professor would give us. I just like taped it in. And the other ideas though I had for my first edition of screen printing were Paul's typewriter for Misery, because at the time I was reading the book and I really loved it. I also thought about doing like my little guys, like little trinkets. These are just like sentences from like my romanticism like art history class, which was not my favorite class, but that's okay. For my paintings, all of them, like my theme that I was kind of going for was like the good old days, but the good old days weren't that actually great. But in a lot of them, I ended up kind of combining it with like what's happening now in like the United States. But these were just like a little bit of notes about like the cliche and like pop culture, and then some of the different things that were happening throughout the time. But I ended up going with my first two paintings being kind of like then and now. So the 1950s and then the 2020s. So the 50s was like typical like housewife, like the perfect housewife. And then the 2020s was like the trad wife, like influencer, like filming what she's doing. And then more pinched ideas. Yeah, like I said, everything's all over the place. I ended up changing my mind, and this is what it came to be, of like a vase with like two little cups, and like technically a vase, but it looked like a bag of coffee, because it was inspired by like how my mom and I would go and get coffee together on like the weekends. And then this was me trying to come up with the designs for the cups. But eventually, as you can see, my piece broke. It broke before it even made it into the kiln. So it ended up getting a little bit of like a different meaning. And I like painted like Forget Me Not, like Coffee Co. And then I made like notes about like what underglazes that I was using. But this was definitely a devastating moment for me when it broke, and I tried repairing it and it just didn't stay. So I had to embrace like the fact that it was cracked, but I eventually got over it, I promise. Now I'm back to my 2020s and like 1950s paintings. So 2020s, like Trad Wife, I used all of my paintings I did in the spring semester, I used like mixed media. So for the Trad Wife one, I used like watercolor paper, and I made these little like frames to be like different quotes that I actually found that like trad wives were posting on like the internet. And then for the 50/50s one, or not the 50/50s, what am I talking about? The 1950s. For that one, I used some fabric and like printable transfers, and I printed off sexist ads from the 50s about like women like being in the kitchen and stuff like that, and I used those to make like curtains that would frame the piece. And yeah, so again, like both pieces, it's kind of like they go together, and it's like, well, this is what it was like in the 50s. Women supposed to like expected to like be in the home and have to do this work and take care of the children and do all of this. And like we've made progress, but it's like now we're like going back in time. So that's kind of like what I was going for in both of my pieces. And then this was just like me like writing notes about my final paper for my art history. It's like enlightenment and romanticism. And then I even like wrote out like my proposal in my sketchbook, and also like my sources, just because I like to write everything out first and then like type it up. I feel like by doing it that way, I'll notice like mistakes or like stuff that I want to add more than if I like type it out and then like reread it on my computer. Next up was screen print edition 2. I thought about, I want you to stop using AI, like the Uncle Sam poster, which I think I really still want to do this in like some kind of print or painting or something. And I eventually ended up doing a piece inspired by Highway to Hell by AC/DC. And this was also like inspired by like a third idea I had was inspired by a drawing I did in my drawing class of like gothic vampire hotel. But I eventually ended up doing AC/DC Highway to Hell. Here's like my little grading sheet again. And then we're going back to painting. This was like then and now in like the same painting. I was inspired by like the then part was like the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program. And then the now was, I saw an article where a Republican representative called kids freeloaders for like getting free school lunches. Also, I apologize for that noise. That is my fridge. But it was again kind of like then and now. Like here was like this great work that like the Black Panther Party was like doing for their like communities and like feeding kids, and they're the whole reason why like the government like ended up doing like the free food program for children. And now like the government like wants to take it away and was like saying all this horrible things about like children who might not have the ability to, you know, get food at home. So maybe like school's like the only chance they'll be able to eat for that day. And I just think it's a very like vile thing. This was my original idea and this is what I was going to do, but I did end up changing my mind, which you will see in a little bit. Cause pins. This was for my metals class. That class kicked me in the butt. It was definitely not my forte. Thank God I was able to end the class or end the semester with an A. So cause pins were different causes that were important to us. And I ended up doing cervical cancer awareness because for those of you who do not know, my mom passed away 2 years ago from cervical cancer, and it's like a cause that's very important to me. So this is kind of like the printed out final design. We had to do 20, but I ended up doing this bat. And one of the things my professor says, it's better for like the pins if you were to be wearing it and somebody to come up to you and ask what it is about, as opposed to it being so incredibly obvious. Because for this, it's not really obvious that it was like, you know, cervical cancer awareness, because like it's like almost on like a Batman like logo with like a uterus on it. But yeah, he really loved the design. And then the bat is because my mom loved bats. After she passed away, my family, well, like my sister, uncle, and I, we all got tattoos. And like Remembrance and I got a bat tattoo. And then this was for another one of my paintings. I was inspired by the satanic panic of the 80s. I know, so incredibly random, and particularly the impact it had on like rock and roll and heavy metal and actually music overall, because Tipper Gore in the Washington Wives, as they were known, created like the parent like music thing. I can't remember, the Parents Music Resource Center, which is like the reason why now there's like the parental advisory stickers on like albums and stuff. but these were like extra like clippings I had like left over that didn't make it onto my piece. So I just kind of like included them in this like little tip in and like wrote a little bit about like what like the piece was about. And the piece eventually ended up being like a very like 80s rock star looking guy besides two older women on a subway. And I used like again printed out pictures and like articles and stuff like that to be like part of like the subway and like surrounding him. I love this piece. I love my guy. My professor really liked him, which made me like super happy. I'm so happy with how he came out. I just very excited about this piece. I feel like it's very like me, like the inclusion of like the history, because I'm such a freaking nerd and I love including history and doing research for paintings, and also rock and roll, because for those of you not familiar with me, I've mentioned it before on here, I absolutely adore rock and roll. It's like one of my favorite things, so I really enjoyed incorporating it into this piece. Next up, these are some more like notes about the cause pin, as well as like other ideas I was coming up with, because we had to have 20, but I eventually did this one. And these were just notes about like in what order I should do the entire process, as well as like you know, just how like I should cut everything out and stuff like that. Next up, we had to do coil pots, large coil pots in my ceramics class. We had to take a historical vessel and give it a contemporary spin. So I found like a Greek like reference. And we were supposed to use slip, but my piece dried out too much, which is originally why I was going to do Batman, because like the colors of the slip would have worked. But I instead ended up doing a rock star vessel. So here's kind of like a little picture of the like drummer, which is like my favorite like side, I'd say, of the piece. It's black and red, and I did like barbed wire around like the top of it. I think it looks really cool. The only issue is like the shape of the piece is so incredibly bad. Like one side looks good and the other one's like kind of lopsided. My professor on Canvas like will leave like comments, and he left one that was like, you know, the shape of this piece like suffered a bit, and I was like, that's like kind of like a kind way of saying it, because it honestly looked like a hot mess, but the designs were cool. So I have to, you know, at least take pride in that, I guess. More notes for my art history class, a lot of them. These were the tattoos for the guy on my rockstar painting. He ended up getting the Too Tough to Die like blade tattoo, the Girl and the Panther, the mom tattoo, and I think the Magic 8 Ball. So he didn't get these 3, but he got 4 of them. And these are like the traditional Sailor Jerry style tattoos, which I personally really enjoy. I have a tattoo right here on my arm, Sailor Jerry style, of like the swallow or whatever with a paintbrush, because I'm an artist, and a nickname my family has had for me ever since I was little was Bird. So it seems like a fitting tattoo, especially for my first one. So this was back again to the then and now of like the Black Panther Party like inspired painting, and where I said I ended up changing my idea. These were notes. I read the book Power Hungry, which was like where I got a lot of my information about like the Black Panther Party, but it was also talks about like Freedom Summer and like the relationship between like activism and like food, not just in terms of like making sure like people have the ability to get the food that they need, but also how like planning and like how like activists will have like a meal together to like plan like what's their next steps and stuff. So that's kind of like the idea I had like when it came to like this table setting. So I ended up taking the square canvas and covering it in orange fabric, and then I took circular canvases and painted them with different meals, and I used canvas paper to like cut out like the silverware and like the book covers that will appear on here. And yeah, so and then I was like making notes about like how many knives I needed to make and or paint and all the books and stuff. And then I included a note with this quote from, oops, sorry, you can't see it, from Fred Hampton about it says, "You can't build a revolution with no education," which I think was really important. On the phones, I included articles. I included the one about the Republican representative calling children freeloaders for getting school lunch or free school lunch. And then I included another one about like Trump taking aim at the Smithsonian, which I find incredibly problematic because it said he wanted to promote like American values, which of course is like a way of like censoring history, which is incredibly problematic. So that's kind of like where the quote about like no education like kind of comes from. And then I was going to include these, but I couldn't find a good way to like include them on my piece. But these are different photos. Again, sorry about the fridge doing that thing. Different photos of like members of the Black Panther Party serving kids at the free breakfast program. But like I said, I didn't have space for them, so I ended up including them in my sketchbook. More art history notes. Skip past those. Here was my screen print, my 3rd edition, which I ended up doing a postcard size. Here's like a little printed out picture of 2 of them, as well as the little grade sheets. But I used like CMYK process, and I made like little postcards for Tangier. So this is just like a clear piece that I accidentally printed on here. And then these were just like some of like the colors, because I did traditional CMYK, but I also like switched out the colors for different ones. So here's like a pale blue layer, here's like a darker blue layer, and then like a red or like magenta layer, just because I thought that they looked really cool, and I decided to you know, tape them in my sketchbook, because why not? This was a project I struggled with so much in ceramics until I like came with an idea. But we had to make a ceramics piece inspired by architecture. Architecture, not my thing at all. So I knew I was going to be struggling with this piece, but I eventually decided on doing the style of googie, which is like 50s, 60s, like space age, which I think is like totally up my alley. So I printed out a bunch of pictures to make like a little mood board, and then I made some notes about like the characteristics and a little bit about the history. And then we didn't have to make one piece all together. We were allowed to make a collection as long as it was like pretty large. So I ended up making a collection of food, particularly diner food inspired by like 60s like space age like architecture. Originally, I was going to do like a DVD holder looking like an old movie theater, but I didn't do that. Also thought about like doing like coffee mugs and stuff, because the name Googie comes from like a coffee shop, but I went with like wow, that was crazy. I ended up going with the diner food. So I did like a burger on a tray, a container of fries, a milkshake, and little ketchup packets. And then these are just notes about like the glazes that I use for everything. And then this was like coming up with ideas for my ceramics final. I had 2 different ideas of doing a set of mugs. It was either movie mugs or inspired by like, again, like the Sailor Jerry tattoos. I ended up doing movie mugs inspired by 4 different horror movies. More notes. These were notes for like my metals class about like these exercises we had to do about like making rings, and then responses for my metals class. Here we are to my final painting, which changed about 50,000 different times, I swear. At first, I was going to be doing something inspired by Cabaret, where it's like, oh, here you're in the show, but you're ignoring reality, and then like pulling back the curtain kind of thing, but including it with like what's happening in the United States. Did not do that. I then ended up doing a piece inspired by this poster, which was made in 1970. No particular artist is like credited to it. It just said that it was made at a printmaking workshop at Berkeley University, but it says fascist infested with the rat on it. And this was made like during the Vietnam War, and I really liked the saying fascist infested, so I ended up doing a map of like the United States with clay bugs and like rats and stuff, like ripping up like the paper and stuff like that. Before I get back to that, here's rings. I had to make in my metals class, our final project was a ring. So this is kind of like what my final idea ended up looking like. I ended up doing an easel with little piece of artworks, and it doesn't have like this part, like the easel itself is like your ring, or like the ring. But yeah, these were just some of my other ideas. But yeah, ended up doing the easel. This was me trying to plan out my semester, my fall semester. I was supposed to be graduating fall 2025, but like I wasn't like, when it comes to art classes, you don't really get like the option to do many over the summer unless they're like studying abroad, and I can't afford that. Then also like one of the only other like art classes over the summer was like knife making, and while it sounds cool, I already know that metals isn't my thing, so I'll just have to take an extra semester. But then I get to graduate in like spring 2026, which is fun because spring graduations are of course bigger. And then at my school they do the senior capstones, which are like exhibitions for like the graduating seniors, or just, you know, whoever's graduating, and they get to kind of like showcase their artwork. So that means I'll get to participate in that, which is really cool. But anyways, this is just more notes about for like art history. This was me like going back to the cabaret idea. Didn't like it. And then this is kind of like how my final ended up looking like for my my final painting. So this is all in newsprint, and then I painted on top of it with like acrylic, also oils, and then I was like ripping up pieces of it to have like bugs underneath of it that were made out of clay. I had like a clay rat sitting on top of like the canvas. Of course, like I said, I'll include pictures, but that's kind of ended up what I ended up going with. And I think it was like a really cool piece. And then in the background it said like fascist infested, which you can't see very well. Like you have to look really closely, which I personally really like about that, because it's not so much in your face like the poster, which my professor liked as well, which made me very happy, because I was kind of like unsure if like people would like it or not, because you couldn't read it that well, but I'm glad she liked it. These are my horror movie mugs. So I did The Thing, I did Return of the Living Dead, again with more notes about like what colors I was using for glazing and everything. I did Scream, and also Misery. Unfortunately for my Misery mug, I did have a casualty, and like part of like the sledgehammer broke off, which definitely makes me sad, but it's okay. And then I was going to do a serving tray, like having it look like one of these like clapboards or whatever they're called, and then it broke before it even got in the kiln, which was okay. I wasn't like too like sad about it. I'm thinking about like buying one of those like wooden serving trays and then painting it to look like a clapboard, but we'll see. More of like responses for like my metals class. These were in my ceramics class, we were allowed to make like whatever we wanted as long as we had the time. So this was me like trying to come up with ideas for like random things to make, especially like mugs and stuff, since they are like food safe, and I wanted to have them as like gifts and stuff. These were glazed notes. You'll see a lot more of these in the end of these were shot glasses I made for my cousin. So like kind of before and after, because you really never know like what the colors are going to look like. Like this is pink and purple, but like the bottom part definitely does not look pink, and that's definitely a lot more like blue than purple. So I decided to include glazed notes in case I wanted to reference them for like other pieces. These were more notes about my final paper, my ring final design. This is kind of what it ended up looking like. Here's more screen printing, and then this is also like the final like grading paper. But I ended up doing CMYK of like my mom's concert tickets that I scanned, and I ended up doing like a whole bunch of different color combos. I did so freaking many, it's ridiculous, but they ended up looking really cool. And then this is like another thing that I thought would be cute that I might paint as opposed to like doing a print out of it, because I just thought he was kind of adorable. More, oh, this was like a practice quiz for like screen printing, and then more about like metals. I have more glazed notes, different shot glasses and mugs that I made, little keychains, more responses for my metals class. So this was stuff I needed to fix for like my metals class, because if we like made improvements, we were allowed to like get our grade up, which was very helpful for me. These were like, if I had the time, which I did, I just didn't end up making more prints in screen printing. I thought about doing something based off of cabaret, and then going back to the I want you to stop using AI, which again, I think I might paint or make prints of, because I kind of like love like the frog, like angry frog being like, I don't want you to use AI. So yeah, even more glazed notes for little trinket dishes that I made. This little guy is my favorite, with like little sad face. I think he's so cute. More glazed notes again about like random crap that I made. I loved this one. I gave it to my cousin. More notes for my art history class, a whole lot of them. This was for like my image list for like my painting class, about like the titles and all of that. And then my artist statement, which I did like build one, and then even more glazed notes. These were pieces we made which are really cool, like patchwork pottery. We had a like visiting professor from Japan, and this is like a technique he uses, and he brought us like these stamps we were allowed to use, and we also like made our own to like decorate our pieces, which I thought was like really cool. And even more glaze notes, and then these are just like the different glazes. And then this is the very end of the very end of my notebook, and I was thinking about, so like I said, the seniors get to do like these exhibitions or like capstones, and I was thinking some of them had like an overall like theme, so I thought it would be cool kind of building on like the rock and roll theme. So this was just me like, kind of like musing about that and like what I could possibly do, and then again just kind of like talking more about that. And then this is the end. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this little like flip through of me talking about my school sketchbook. I'm sorry that I've been away for so long, but I'm definitely trying to come back, or like be back. I think the next video I'm going to make is a journaling ecosystem, which has been popular the past couple of months. And there's definitely been some changes since I last made that video where I was talking about like the journals and notebooks and sketchbooks and planners and crap that I was going to be using this year. So yeah, I think that'll be next. But anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day, an absolutely amazing weekend. And yeah, stay safe out there. Take care of yourselves. I know like the news and stuff has been like really horrible lately. It's good to stay informed, but it's also really good to take care of your mental health. Take a break if you need it. Take your time and just read a book or just watch silly little YouTube videos like this one. But yeah, like I said, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day.